Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are tackling a concept that completely pushes the boundaries of how we understand global governance. We're going to frame our narrative around the staggering, really extreme limits of international law and the absolute bedrock principle of state sovereignty.
So, let's just dive right into the central paradox here. Can international law actually, legally, abolish itself? I know, it sounds like a total riddle, right? But what if the ultimate, absolute final expression of international law might actually be its own legal destruction?
To unpack how this bizarre scenario could even be theoretically possible, here is the deductive cascade we're going to follow today. We'll start with sovereignty and treaty freedom, then look at rewriting absolute rules. From there, we'll examine global succession chains, the resulting domino effect, the transition to internal law, and finally, the end of international law.
All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Sovereignty and Treaty Freedom.
At the very foundation of international law lies this really fascinating premise: total treaty-making freedom. See, in classical international law, sovereign states are both the creators and the subjects of the rules. There's no higher world sovereign, no giant global legislature dictating terms from above. Because the whole system is entirely consent-based, states have this absolute autonomy to decide if they want to enter into treaties, who they want to partner with, and exactly what content to agree upon. So if every single state agrees to a new rule, the legal reality changes instantly, simply because that underlying source of authority, their collective consent, has shifted. Now, treaties are the visible part of all this freedom, but customary international law serves as the much deeper, more universal foundation. Specifically, we're talking about opinio juris. It's basically this universal legal conviction that an action is being carried out as a legal obligation. So the ultimate source of legal authority is this ongoing active recognition by states. If universal consensus is reached, like if all states suddenly change their practice and their belief universally, they can literally override obsolete arrangements and shift the legal reality overnight.
Moving right along to Section 2, Rewriting Absolute Rules.
So, if states hold this ultimate constitutive power, the theory goes that they can collectively change absolutely anything. But what happens when we hit what might seem like an unbreakable brick wall? Enter just Cogens. These are peremptory norms. Think of things like the absolute prohibitions on genocide or torture. Traditionally, we see these as the ultimate limits to a state's treaty-making freedom. Any individual treaty that tries to contradict them is instantly void. But, structurally speaking, are they truly eternal? The really fascinating answer from legal theorists is no. Actually, they aren't. Just Cogens norms are only mandatory against partial or individual attempts to break them. If universal consensus is actually reached, that collective agreement holds the absolute power to override previous norms. Against a truly universal legal conviction, there's literally no permanent barrier. This kind of massive change can happen either through a brand new universal treaty or new universal customary law. It's basically the highest possible expression of state consent in action.
Okay, Section 3, Global Succession Chains and Global Consolidation.
Let's apply this absolute freedom to a totally bizarre but legally mind-blowing what-if scenario, to analyze how legal transformation happens through global succession chains. Acting as sort of neutral legal anthropologists here, let's look at the theoretical scenario of Deed 1400/98. Imagine a single buyer supposedly purchasing global sovereignty. How on earth do you do that? Well, through an all-encompassing transfer clause, basically buying a property with all rights and obligations. This explores what theoretically happens if a single actor tries to unify all global sovereignty just by stepping into the shoes of the original sovereign states.
Mechanically, how would that even work? Well, the theory relies on these massive interlocking treaty chains. It starts with step 1, a local infrastructure sale. Let's say a military barracks or a residential complex is sold as a single unit of development. Because that local infrastructure is physically and contractually hardwired to national grids, the theory posits it automatically links to NATO agreements in Step 2, which are then integrated with UN frameworks in Step 3, and eventually merges into global telecommunications networks like the ITU in Step 4. Suddenly, all these wildly diverse institutions interlock through the automatic mutual recognition of treaties. It's like a giant puzzle snapping together.
Which brings us to Section 4, the domino effect and global expansion.
Those interlocking treaty chains we just talked about, they create this incredible, kinetic, cascading expansion of sovereign claims, a concept known as juridical singularity.
When a property is sold with all its rights and obligations, and it happens to include physical supply networks like electricity, gas, or telecommunications, it literally creates a domino effect. The global infrastructure physically integrates frameworks that used to be completely separate.
The crucial engine driving this whole thing is something called net territoriality. Because the supply networks are sold as one single unit of development, the sovereign claims theoretically expand outward, riding right along the physical cable connections. It crosses straight into overlapping territories all over the globe. And as these networks leave one territory and enter another, they trigger a chain reaction, locking diverse global institutions together. So international law essentially shifts from traditional lines on a map geographic borders to a highly integrated functional net territoriality.
Now for the endgame. Section 5. Internal law, the final transition.
This is the real climax of this whole theoretical transformation. We really need to examine this transition from international law to internal law. Think about it. International law fundamentally requires a plurality of states, the inter in international, right? But if a single unified global architecture or world state is somehow formed through these massive succession chains we just discussed, that plurality completely vanishes. If all states merge into one, the universal consensus transforms the entire international order into a singular internal law. There is simply no longer a between to govern.
And that results in a truly fascinating paradox known as tabula rasa, or the clean slate. Because this hypothetical buyer, or the unified world state, now represents literally all sides of previous international treaties, those treaties effectively just become agreements with yourself. This weird phenomenon is called self-contraction. Former international obligations transform into purely voluntary internal regulations, leaving the new sovereign with a completely clean slate to redesign the global order however they see fit.
And finally, Section 6, the end of international law. So let's take this deductive cascade to its absolute extreme finish line. Selbstaufhebung des Völkerrechts, the theoretical self-abolition of international law. I know, it's a very dense German legal concept, but it basically just means that because there's dogmatically no superior instance, no higher authority to prevent sovereign states from voluntarily surrendering their individual plurality to form a collective entity, they actually possess the absolute right to legally end the international system itself.
So, to wrap up everything we've covered today, international law is not some fixed, rigid constitutional order. It's a highly dynamic, self-modifying system. It absolutely requires a plurality of sovereign subjects to exist. Because universal consent holds the ultimate constitutive power, the collective community of states can legally dissolve the system, consolidating it into a single internal legal architecture. The ultimate legal expression of international law is, quite literally, its ability to consensually destroy itself.
Which leaves us with this final really provocative question to chew on. If sovereignty requires no higher authority, is its ultimate destiny to just consume itself? It's a fascinating paradox about the absolute limit of treaty-making freedom, and it definitely leaves you pondering the true fragility of global governance. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer.